So first of all, everybody, I'm really thrilled to be able to have a chance to introduce Dr. Ken Carpenter. I'm going to give you his official bio in just a second. I had the pleasure of training with him pre-pandemic, and then a little bit into the pandemic. I think we did some Zoom training during that period of time too, and so really glad to be able to have him here. He is a clinical psychologist. I'm going to read this so I get it right. And the director of training for the Center for Motivational Change and Foundation for Change. He has been involved in helping individuals with substance use disorders for 25 years. He's also been developing and researching treatment strategies for individuals and families. And he and his colleagues at the CMCFFC have been bringing these evidence-supported ideas and strategies together in the Invitation to Change approach, which is a model for helping families and friends. And may also say that the colleagues that he works with, and who also I had the opportunity to train with Dr. Jeffrey Foote, is the author and co-author of the book Beyond Addiction. So I always want to give that plug as well. So thank you again, Ken, for being here. And so let's just start with talking about the Invitation to Change approach. This is a relatively new model. And so kind of one question, like, well, what was wrong with the old models that we needed to and tell us a little bit about what's different about Invitation to Change.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Mark. Appreciate it, and great to see you again, although in the remote world. The ITC really came together with the work I was doing with Dr. Foote and parent coaching. And you make a great point. What's different about that with all the other models that are out there? And this really is developed over the years with direct feedback from families and friends who are trying to help loved ones who are struggling with substance use issues. What's different about it, I think, when we think about all the different other programs out there, the ITC really wants to emphasize and make room for the power of personal connections. When we think about helping, that so much of the power of helping comes from the interpersonal connections we have with loved ones. So it really emphasizes the importance of that as a helping, creating a context for helping. And at the same time, kind of, I think puts a different spin on self-care, which really allows and makes room for when you find yourself in the helping role, what it really means to embrace your humanity and the experience of being a human being, caring and trying to help another individual. So self-care isn't defined on doing nice things for yourself, but I think in this particular set of lenses helps and gives room for people to connect with their values, their imperfections, the feelings and struggles that come up with helping loved ones, and really an emphasis on how can you mentor yourself and support yourself in a more helpful, compassionate stance as you're trying to do the hard work of caring and supporting a loved one who's struggling. We kind of house that under one umbrella. And I think it gives a different flavor and experience for people who are trying to help their loved ones from this particular angle.
No, I love that, because I always say that self-care is not a luxury. It is a requirement, really, that in order for you to be able to use the skills that you teach, you have to have that self-care piece on board. You have to be able to do that reflection and be able to see yourself and your emotions so that you can then engage your loved one from a space of compassion and understanding, as opposed to just, I guess, reacting because they've done something that irritates you.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on.
And so the Invitation to Change approach is built on the CRAFT model, but then it's got some other pieces that you have kind of added to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly CRAFT has been around since '99, at least when it first hit the journal articles on the clinical, its research base. So to your point, I think some of the important principles that the Invitation to Change model has, and certainly you can find them in CRAFT, is the importance of thinking about positive reinforcement, And when we think about creating a context of change, where you'll see these ideas in both models is how do you build scaffolding that supports and reinforces change, and be a little strategic in how you're responding to the actions of your loved one when you're in their presence. And that's a big part of craft, with some of the ideas that communication is key. So there's communication skills that can be very important, since as human beings, most of our interactions are verbal and we talk. So how can we use that in a helpful way? And again, to your point, we don't want to lose the helper in the context of support. So we want to also, and as craft does as well, think about nourishing oneself. The language may be a little different, but the concept is there.
And so you mentioned positive reinforcement. And sometimes I hear from family members or reading things online, it's hard sometimes to find that positive reinforcement. What do you tell family members who say, well, what am I supposed to reinforce if drinking frequently or using frequently? How do I even begin to do that?
Hey, look, it can be challenging. And I think to your point, it comes to the strength of our lenses. And often one thing to think about is sometimes we may have to have more powerful eyeglasses to be able to see the smaller things that are occurring. And that's not always easy, often in the context of witnessing a whole bunch of behaviors that we don't want to support, or that are scary, or are causing conflict. Trying to see, even buried in that whole kind of garden of behaviors, the smaller flowers that are still trying to grow, can be challenging. So often it's this practice, as you've mentioned before, even stepping back and think about what we're looking for, and what can we find, even if they're tiny steps as a starting point. Some gardens, the flowers are fully grown, they're easy to see, and sometimes some gardens are a little bit more challenging. So the small flowers it takes a little different set of lenses to find.
And so I love that, and I think during the training you guys use the analogy of sometimes using the positive reinforcement microscope, to your point of looking for small things. So, but for a family member who thinks, well, but I know they just need to go to rehab, or I know they just need to go to treatment. What's the value for them of the positive microscope, if you will?
Right, it's a great point. I can think of it in two ways. One, from just if I put on a research cap and we just look at treatment outcomes, even studies that look at, well, if I'm a loved one and I want to support my loved one who's in treatment, if I learn these skills, does it really matter on how helpful treatment is? And, research certainly points to the direction that for someone who's in treatment, their outcomes actually are better if their loved ones are also able to practice reinforcement and communication strategies. It's just a scaffolding that supports a loved one's attempts in treatment. So on that front, I want to get my loved one into treatment. And how could the reinforcement be helpful? Well, we know it just builds a better and supportive context to help amplify what people are learning in treatment and keep them at it where things at times can be tough. And it also nourishes relationships, which we know are key in long-term change. And that's ultimately the other lens here, is what helps supports the long journey for change. And rehab and treatment is a great start. But there's a lot of life miles after that as well. So what helps support that continued journey? And this reinforcement is a key ingredient to that.
I love that, because I always would tell people, don't take your foot off the gas just because all of a sudden they got into treatment and there's this big sigh of relief. Well, okay, now he or she is in treatment and everything's going to be okay, and I can stop. I don't have to do any of this stuff anymore. And you're saying, no, actually, you really need to continue that, because you need to continue the communication process and building, as you said, the scaffolding and those skills, so that, because they don't just magically get better in treatment, and that family involvement, and now you have the data that shows that this really makes a difference. You learn those skills and you keep doing them while they're in treatment and out of treatment, which can actually be one of the more dangerous times, is going from treatment to back home. To really have family members learn those skills, so important. So I'm really glad that you made that point.
Yeah.
I know one of the things about invitation to change that is different is the use of motivational interviewing. So I posted something online, saying, hey, one of the topics that we're going to be talking about, it's like, do you need a master's degree to use motivational interviewing? And so let's talk a little bit about what is motivational interviewing. How do we use that in this process of developing a collaborative relationship and moving somebody to treatment?
Yeah, and it's amazing when we think, even with the motivational interviewing aspect, it often sits on shelves of counselors' offices, or it's in the secret corner of the counseling world. When you kind of just pull the curtain back on it, it's how do you have helpful conversations? That's what MI is trying to do. And just as a sidebar, really part of its growth came from the fact that they would train counselors to know all the right skills about how to help people. But when they were looking at outcomes, they were still finding that certain counselors had better outcomes. The people that were working with certain counselors were doing better than others, even though all the counselors knew the same stuff. So the question was like, well, what's going on that's different? And part of what they found was, well, it depends on how the counselor is speaking with the individual they're sitting with. That was really important. If a counselor was speaking and communicating in ways that were supportive, people were more likely to make changes versus counselors that weren't. So that the ingredients of MI really started to flow from, well, how can we unpack helpful conversations? And anyone can really learn that. It doesn't have to be in the back pocket of someone who's got a psychology degree or social work degree or mental health degree. And they did a study over in Europe, which was fascinating, which was parents who their children had psychiatric issues and were in treatment for that, but they were all smoking a lot of pot. And parents came for support, and there were two versions of the support they got. Some parents kind of were able to just talk about the difficulties and get support that way. Other parents went to a group where they were able to get peer support and talk about difficulties, but they also learned MI ingredients for conversations. So they could do MI at home and have MI kind of type conversations at the dinner table. And what they found was the kids who were living in the houses where the parents learned MI conversational skills, they were doing better. They were more likely to make changes. So just shows that MI at the dinner table. And what I mean by that really is we can break it down to just certain skills that send invitations to loved ones to talk more. That helps us as listeners to be able to listen and respond in ways that just keep conversations going and to help kind of sprinkle and water people's own motivations to want to make change. And that motivation can wax and wane, but there are certain ways we can talk with people to keep that engagement process going. And that's what MI really, in a lot of ways, tries to teach people. So certainly knowable and learnable for anyone who talks.
And so that's really good to know. Can we break down like an example of, because I know there are certain like tenets of the main components of motivational interviewing. So let's say, for example, that a family member has a conversation, to kind of your point about like, well, how does the conversation go? So the tone matters also, not just the words that are used. But so we'll go back to, hey, I want them to go to rehab. And the person is resistant to going to rehab, or just says no, or doesn't want to engage in the conversation, but may have given some inkling that they know there's a problem. How might you use motivational interviewing skills in that kind of a situation, like at the dinner table, as you were talking about? What would that look like?
Well, to your point, I think one, it's when we think about these lenses of what are you looking at and seeing. So to your point, I could look at the fact that perhaps my loved one doesn't want to go to rehab and see that and respond to that as they don't want treatment. They're not considering change because of the way I'm defining it. So I could respond to that in ways that are, well, I need to convince them, or I need to talk some sense into them. I need them to see my perspective on change. So that's one strategy. And that could make me talk in certain ways. You're not listening to me. You need to. You're not being, certain statements that could come out. Now, the roll of the dice there is I might start to hear my loved one start to defend their reasoning more strongly. And so I get in this back and forth where ultimately what I'm encouraging my loved one to do is argue their position of not wanting to go to rehab more strongly. What I have missed is that they are thinking about change because some things aren't working for them. And you had said that was the other piece, which is they may be considering their behavior isn't 100% working for them. Now, if I shifted my perspective to that and invited them to talk more about that, tell me more about that. What is it that's not fitting? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Notice I've taken the mic away from I can't go to rehab voice to here are my thoughts about what things aren't working. Now, that's not the same outcome. They're not saying they go to rehab. However, in that conversation, I'm talking about change. I'm asking them to contemplate and think out loud about what their thoughts are. And if I'm getting green lights, what are their thoughts on what would be most helpful? If things were different, what would they like to be seen? And notice that voice is a voice of change. So the MI style is what voice do I want to befriend? And which voice can I see at the table? Because there'll be multiple voices. So MI wants to help me have a conversation with the voice that might be a little bit closer to making changes. Now, as a helper, I may really want them to be seeking help, but that's not where they're at. And if I try to push hard on that, I might actually have them dig their heels in, and I've missed the opportunity for another door of conversation that might be closer to thinking about change.
Yeah, I love that, Ken, because so you're talking about, well, you have to first of all meet the person where they are. And I always say, like, not where you want them to be, because then you're missing the boat. And so it's kind of like ordering an Uber to take you to the airport, and the driver calls you from the airport and says, I'm here at the airport. And you're like, but I'm still at home. And you're like, well, yeah, but I want you to, your destination is the airport. And so if our destination is just rehab, but we're not understanding what's going on where they are and not hearing that voice, then we're really missing out. And so I love how you put it that when it kind of gets to become an argument, like you, person's kind of like going to shift into fight or flight and become defensive. And now they're articulating reasons why not to go to rehab, as opposed to, as you said, getting them to talk out loud and hear in their own voice reasons why, yeah, maybe this isn't working for me. Even if they don't in that conversation say, okay, I'm ready to go, you say, well, I got to build some scaffolding.
Right. And I liked what you said about meeting where the person's at with the Uber example, because one thing I could think about, like you said, is I could be a mile down the road and my loved one can be a mile away. And there's really a choice. I could stay there and wait for them to show up at the end of that mile walk to have my conversation. Or I could try to meet them where they're at and talk to them as they're walking. I have many more opportunities to have that conversation as we walk together than waiting for them to show up at my location. It's MI, as you said, meeting where someone's at allows us to have more conversations as we journey somewhat together than not. It's just opening more doors and opportunities to create a context for helping. And that's the benefit of meeting someone where they're at.
Well, I also like how you said, well, I could wait and see if they show up where I am. And that kind of reminds me about how there is this thinking that, well, you know, you just have to kind of detach from them and let them hit rock bottom, and then they will magically decide that, okay, I need to change. And I'll be honest, that scares me to death. So I'm curious about like how you feel about waiting for rock bottom.
And that can be really tough for families when they think that's sometimes the messaging people get, which is the only thing you can do here is just let your loved one fall until they hit that very bottom. That's the only way. So there's a lot to unpack with that. But to your point, I think often you can hear about raising the bottom. That's not taking away that people are learning both from the positives and the feedback in life. You know, the bumps and bruises of living, we all do experience as human beings, and that helps us think about the way we're walking in life. At the same time, by keeping communication open and offering reinforcement for other things, it's helping build scaffolding that helps invite change in sooner than just letting people free fall until the fall stops. Sometimes with consequences that don't necessarily need to happen to be learning tools. So I think we term it natural consequences. Life teaches us all the time, both in reinforcement and bumps and bruises. In the invitation to change approach, we try to really help and think about how can we build scaffolding that removes the free fall and may raise the bottom and create invitations for change sooner than would happen than if all that was cut off. And an analogy I use is gardening, which is and we spoke about this when we were in our training together, if I want to tend to a garden, I do have to be careful about weeds. Yeah. And I also need to tend to strengthen the flowers I want to grow. If my approach is to cut off all the water until the weeds kind of die, I'll probably risk not having flowers to grow as well. So I need to think of it in a nuanced ways to support that which we want to, and just be careful about how I want to not support inadvertently behaviors I don't want to strengthen.
I really like that garden analogy, and the fact that you say, well, it's a nuanced approach, and it suggests that, hey, that we do need to practice these things, and that what I always try to tell people is, and it's one of the things that you guys kind of drum into our heads from the very beginning, is like first thing practice, and that is that you may try like the MI skills, and you may try some of these things, and it might not work exactly as how you want it to do. So you take that as feedback, and you come back and you practice some more, and you keep doing it over and over again until you keep getting better at it. Because if you can raise the bottom, then you've got a much greater chance of success. And in today's world, where just this past week, where the CDC came out with the number of overdose deaths, just heartbreaking this past year. So when I think of rock bottom, when I used to work with guys who were homeless, you would think, well, if you're homeless and you burnt all your bridges where nobody wants to have you at home, that's about as rock bottom as you could get, right? They still relapse, they still keep going. And so whenever I talk to people about rock bottom, it's, hey, as long as you're still alive, things can always get worse. And to me, rock bottom is death. And so that's why I like the fact to say, well, let's raise the bottom. So let's, let some of the natural consequences that aren't going to be mortal take effect, but not just have a total hands-off approach.
Right, and to your point, there's a roll of the dice. Even if you wanted to do a dive in some of the science is what people find reinforcing depends on how many other reinforcers are around it. So one of the challenges with this is if there is no other reinforcement in an individual's life, and the only thing left is substance use, the value of substance use keeps going up. We talk, so to your point, rock bottom in a way, but what I mean by raising the bottom too is if we create a context for helping that offers choices, connection, and support, it can be helpful because it just keeps other things in an individual's life that they can connect with than keep taking stuff out of life, which has its own challenges. And to your point, this isn't an easy journey, and by all means, when you see the CDC and others, not to take the reality as a helper, as a loved one, this can be hard. And practice is key. And to your point earlier, well, what's the importance of self-care as we're defining it? It's not just about doing nice things. It's also knowing that practice means we're not going to be great at this. And it can be hard, and there'll be some imperfections. If I beat myself up and can't tolerate my imperfections in trying this stuff out, that's going to make it a heavy lift. So this idea of caring for myself and being able to tolerate my own imperfections and trying it and staying with it is key. So, and that's where you'll also find an invitation to change is this idea of self-compassion, or at least being a positive mentor voice to ourselves is really important, because this isn't always an easy thing to start to put into play.
Not at all. And it's for the family member, tends to be that if they're willing to brave the stigma and talk to somebody about it, oftentimes the only solution that somebody else has, or the only comment somebody else has is, well, don't enable them. And I find sometimes that fear can be almost paralyzing. Like, how do I know if I'm enabling or not enabling? And it's just, it becomes numbing. So can you just kind of briefly talk about, what is enabling and what is not enabling?
Yeah, no, that's such a great point, Mark. And I'm going to take a step back for one sec, because if you look up the definition of enabling, what shows up first, if you're lucky enough, is to make possible, practical, or easy, or to give someone the authority or means to do something. So if we just look at the meaning of the word, it's helping someone accomplish something, giving someone a bridge to be able to do something, to make something possible. So from that perspective, I usually invite people, let's think about it in terms of this. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. There's a lot of things when we think about our relationships. We love to try to help enable for people or make possible. Enabling our loved ones to have a valued life, enabling our loved ones to pursue interests that they'll find useful, to enable our loved ones to get a job or to get to their friends. So there are things we want to help people do. Now, all the definitions after that, if you Google it, everything else that follows, you'll see all about addiction, substance use, and and everything else. So it's just interesting how the word has been captured and been spun to think that making something possible for someone is something to be weary of, and you're being bad if you're that type of person. But to your point, so if we say there's nothing wrong in trying to make things possible for people, then the next question is, what are the things I want to help make possible for my loved one? And what are some of the things I just want to be careful not to make possible? So enabling isn't bad. It's in the process of making things possible for someone. I want to focus my attention on certain things and be careful to not focus on behaviors that I might think are harmful for my loved one. So I can be an enabler in some ways, and I want to be not an enabler in other ways. So you mentioned the word nuance in our conversation. The whole idea with ITC, and we can even unpack craft, is how can I reinforce and strengthen the parts of my loved one that I want to support, and just be thoughtful and intentional in not supporting other things. But I can still support the parts of my loved one I want to help grow. And that's okay. That's being loving. That's being, and that's often natural when we're in relationships, because that's what gets pulled from us, to want to support others. That's okay. There are times I just need to be thoughtful about how I'm going about doing that. So can we have conversations to think in that nuanced way and not feel shameful about it or punished for it?
Yes, right. And I think that's what gets people is the shame and exactly goes along with that. So helping somebody is not automatically bad enabling. That might be something that actually is strengthening that communication. That might be part of the scaffolding that you're talking about. Right. And so when you think about how somebody who is in the midst of addiction and how much shame that they have, that, you know, when they can't get help, it becomes almost more debilitating for them and pushes them further away. But you know, as you said, well, you need to kind of be skillful about it, and you might make mistakes in it. In doing so, and you might like give somebody money for something and then realize, well, they use it all for drugs. I need to find a better way of helping them get food, maybe, or something, so that I'm going to learn in this process. And just kind of like I always tell the client who is that I'm treating for the substance problem, everything is feedback, everything is data. So if you do something and doesn't work out the way you hoped, you don't have to beat yourself up. You don't have to punish yourself, as kind of, because you said you take it as feedback and data and you learn from it.
Yeah, and that there's a freedom in that, Mark, in your message, which allows for practicing and getting feedback and just trying it again and based on that feedback over time. No one's given a perfect set of instructions on the challenges in life, and that is the process of learning, which is trying and getting feedback.
Yeah. Well, and it is a process. So maybe we'll end with that and just recognizing that this is something that is a process, and that we do have to practice with that. And I think I remember that there was another P word, which was patience, which is something that can be difficult to work on as well. But I don't want to overstay your patience, and so I'm gonna go ahead and we'll bring this to a close. And I will just again thank you very much for your time and your passion for this topic and your wisdom. And maybe I can get Dr. Flick to come on and talk too. You have to let him know that you know it was okay.
For sure.
And maybe we can do this again.
Sure.
So
thank you for your face group and Facebook group. Community is huge, and breaking isolation and having a platform for people to share experiences and be in the company of others is just such a big part I think, and helpful part of this journey. So offering a platform and being there is so important. So thank you for creating that space for people.
All right. All right, well, if anybody has any comments, feel free to leave them after you watch the video, and if you have further questions, that we'll tackle those as well. Thank you very much.